The last topic we're going to cover in Chapter 2 is what's called chemical nomenclature, which is just a fancy word for naming. Since we have so many different elements that we can combine in sort of many different ways, we need a system for naming all the different possibilities we can come up with. Now, we are going to focus in our class on what are known as inorganic compounds. These are things that are generally don't have carbon, with a few exceptions. We'll look at some carbon-containing molecules. Because carbon in particular has a very rich chemistry where you can combine carbon in lots of different ways. We'll go into a little bit of the nomenclature for carbon containing compounds, but mostly we're not going to talk about it much in this class. And we'll leave that for those of you continuing into organic chemistry in your second year. There you'll get to learn about organic nomenclature. So we're going to be focusing on inorganic compounds and how do we name them. And so we'll start with what are known as we'll start with molecular compounds. Binary molecular compounds, meaning these are compounds that just have only two elements. Obviously, there are many more compounds that have multiple elements, but we'll start with the simple binary molecular compounds and learn how to name them and then go from there. And so these are, so let's just look at an example of a binary molecular compound. Let's look at this molecule right here. 1 carbon, 1 oxygen. How do we name this? And so there's a multi-step sort of process we can go through here. So the first thing we have is the first word is just the first element in the formula. Okay, and so in this case that'll be carbon. Number 2, the second word. For the second element, we change the ending to IDE, ide. Okay, so here we would change oxygen to oxide. All right. And then the final thing we need to do is to use prefixes to specify the number of each element. Okay, so in the case of, for the first element, since there's only 1 carbon, we just leave it as carbon. And for our second element, we need to say there's only 1 oxygen. And so there's a series of prefixes that we use. This is table 2.2 in your textbook. Is a quick reference, but I'll write some of them down here. So we have for 1, we use the prefix mono. For 2, di. 3 is tri. 4 is tetra. 5 is penta. 6 is hexa. 7 is hepta. 8 is octa. Make sure that looks like an O. 9 is nona. You won't see these ones very much. And 10 is deca. And there are prefixes beyond 10, but we won't encounter them in this class. Even 9 and 10 don't show up very much, and even 8. So most of the ones we'll use are on this side over here, but just so that you have the full list all the way up to 10, these are the prefixes that we use. So coming back to our carbon, we need to specify in the second element. So, in theory, we could say monocarbon monoxide or monoxide. But in general, for the first element, if it's a single, if it's mono, we just leave off the prefix. So this becomes CO becomes carbon monoxide. And when there are two O's next to each other, we just drop one of the O's. So it doesn't become monoxide, it's just monoxide. All right, and carbon monoxide is a poisonous gas that you've probably heard of before. Now, if we have a slightly different, where there are two oxygens, here we're just going to change the prefix for the second one. So carbon dioxide. And this is a gas that we're all too familiar with. What about if there's more than one in the first element? So let's look at, oops, wrong control there. There we go. So let's look at this compound, N2O5. So in this case, it's not just one atom in the first element, so we need to use a prefix there as well. So here we get dinitrogen, and then we need to look at our prefixes. For 5, it's pentaoxide. In fact, I believe we cut the A there, but I'll accept if you called it this, I wouldn't mark you wrong. I think it's technically that A goes missing, just like on monoxide, we drop the O. So dinitrogen pentoxide, N2O5. All right, and so that's the basic idea of how we name binary molecular compounds. Now, some binary molecular compounds are used so much that they have very common names. One example is, of course, water, H2O. If we use this naming system, it would be dihydrogen monoxide, but nobody calls it that. Everyone just calls it water. And there are a few more of those. Another common one is ammonia, which would be nitrogen trihydride, but we just call it ammonia. And so you'll get practice with these. We'll practice this in class as well as you'll get to practice it in your homework as well. So that's our first set of chemical nomenclature for naming molecular compounds that just are composed of two elements. The next thing we'll look at is naming ionic compounds.